Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this Veterans Day, and a warm and hearty hello to all of our veterans who have served and are watching Alaska Weather tonight. We salute you. On this 11th of November, we encourage you always to stay up to date on your latest weather information. You can do that by going to weather.gov or arh.noaa.gov. You're always welcome to call the Weather Info line at 800-472-0391. Find us on any number of these services, from the web to Facebook, Twitter, and of course on YouTube. And after this broadcast, you'll be able to find the complete broadcast of Alaska Weather through our partner here at alaskapublic.org, simply by looking on the right-hand side of your screen or going to AKwx TV on YouTube. Tonight's hazardous weather includes a lot of wind moving over the Alaska Range and across southwestern Alaska. Combine that with the warm and wet air, and we also have an issue of rain and freezing rain developing in the lower and middle Yukon Valley and AKwx Valley. Across the Alaska Range, let's talk about that first. Wind advisories will go until 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. We're expecting gusts around the eastern and western Alaska Range and the Deltana and Tanana Flats regions, especially for areas west of the Tok Cutoff and the passes there, to look at gusts around the 50 to 60 mile an hour range. So it's going to be breezy, if not blustery tonight, and in some cases it may be rather gusty for a little while. So kind of batten down the hatches there. Across the lower and middle Yukon valleys and the AKwx Valley, we're expecting to see rain and snow develop. A better chance for snow the further north you go, but at times there's going to be some issues with some freezing rain, probably less than 5/100ths of an inch. That's not a whole lot, but it's enough to make things slippery. And of course, if you have some colder surfaces that could freeze fairly quickly there, it's probably not enough to cause any issues with any power lines unless they're really weak. So good news there that we're not expecting a whole lot of freezing rain to develop, but it is going to be getting slick, and a winter weather advisory will continue for those areas again at least until early Wednesday morning. Now across southwestern Alaska, a little more wind is moving across Kodiak Island, and then north of King Salmon, the winds should really be picking up. Because of that, we expect the winds to increase as we head through tonight, and through midday tomorrow, we should expect some south and easterly winds with gusts upwards of 80 miles per hour. And that's going to develop as we go through noon tomorrow, and as such, a high wind warning is in effect for the Bristol Bay region, generally north of King Salmon. So expect a lot more wind to develop through the evening hours and then continue through noon tomorrow. As we look at the weather pattern across the Bering Sea, we continue in a very unsettled pattern across most of the Bering. You can see several areas of low pressure now. You'd probably earn a prize if you could figure out exactly which one was still associated with the remnants of Nuri. That circulation's still out there, and it's right about there. As we watch that spin around, over the next 24 to 36 hours, this is going to slowly drop southward and finally merge with a larger storm system in circulation out across the Gulf of Alaska. That means what was that big Bering Sea storm, what was the super typhoon Nuri, is going to be kaput. It's all gone now. That southeasterly flow still working up the west coast of Alaska, pushing a tremendous amount of warm and wet air further and further north. And if you've heard some of the weather news across the rest of the nation, all that cold air that should be up in the Arctic is dropped southward into the lower 48. So it's got to go somewhere, and it is not over Alaska right now. Several other waves of warm and wet low pressure are working their way from southwest to north and east, but the general circulation will likely guide those into the Gulf as we go ahead. Here's a look at the rest of the map across Alaska, and you'll notice our friends in southeastern Alaska, especially Juneau, look a little bit devoid of cloud cover right now. Look at the clouds gradually lift away. Well, after 40 days of wet weather, it's about time, I guess. Juneau is also one of the wetter spots in the entire state, of course, if not one of the more rain-prone spots in the region. But after 40 days of soggy weather, they are breaking free, and it looks like tomorrow will be another dry day for you. Some areas of fog will be expected over the next couple nights, of course, with the clear skies, but the brunt of the moisture has shifted westward toward Kodiak. and places in southwestern Alaska. And the Kenai Peninsula. Around Homer today, it wasn't wet necessarily, but it sure was warm. Temperatures there well into the 50s. But for places like Seward and Kodiak, you picked up more than 1.5 inches of precipitation there. It looks like the wet weather will continue traveling up the south and western coast toward the Seward Peninsula, the lower and middle Yukon Valley, and the Arctic coast. You can see the cloud cover spreading northward there. Behind that, drier air is coming in on the western side of that low pressure system. We have a much larger low here, though, across the central and western Gulf, and that is working to keep that warm air moving northward and keeping the unsettled pattern across the central and western sections of our state. The interior, though, eastward dries up fairly quickly, and with that, there's still plenty of room for cold days and cold nights. And that's allowing places like Northway and Barrow to keep the snow on the ground. There's about 3 to 4 inches of snow on the ground in those areas. However, with warm weather making it all the way up to Barrow and even further north, some of that snow could recede just somewhat, and some of the ice already has across some of the south and western coasts. Here's a look at our weather pattern right now. Obviously, warmer air is moving out of the Gulf, and you can see that wrapping into Kodiak Island and the northern Gulf Coast. Pockets of rainfall were seen west of the western Alaska Range, and we've got a trough of low pressure here that's no doubt given some pilots a little bit of trouble today, a little shake on the stick. Around the Yukon Valley, you can see other areas of clouds and showers developing around Kotzebue Sound. Colder air is northward, but that's not going anywhere. It's going to pretty much stall out tonight. And a trough of low pressure across the Bering at 974 millibars. High pressure at 1,050 millibars across the south and eastern corner of the Yukon and northern sections of British Columbia. This is a stout high pressure system, and that is working that cold away from Alaska. By tonight, plenty of warm air working into south central and southwestern Alaska, and that's going to increase the winds, especially north of King Salmon as we go through tonight. There's going to be some pockets of snow, primarily west of the Parks Highway and also across the lower and middle Yukon Valley. You might see a couple inches of snow there, but a little bit further down the road, expect a better chance for rain and freezing rain to develop, and snow will not be the predominant source there. Out across the southern Bering Sea, 990 millibar low there continues working its way southward and begins to merge by Wednesday afternoon with a stronger low across the southern Gulf at 988 millibars. Our high pressure is still protecting southeastern Alaska. Winds should remain relatively light there and should keep the sky pretty clear. You'll notice the drier weather right across the Alcan border is starting to be infringed a little bit more by some of that Pacific moisture working its way eastward. But as far as precipitation goes, it's all across the west, for Kotzebue Sound, Norton Sound, all the way down toward Bristol Bay. Most areas there dealing with rain or some variant of it, rain mixed with snow, or at worst, freezing rain. And again, most areas should see relatively light accumulations, if any at all. Hopefully it's rain mixed with snow for you. Pockets of the Bering Sea will still be looking at rain showers, and you can see several circulations still showing up here. 994 millibar low west of the Pribilofs, and one just to the north and east will push some north and westerly flow through the central and western chain. Places like Shemya today, already starting out in that flow, picked up a little bit of snow. Westerly winds will continue across many areas through the western chain, but southeasterly winds are working their way westward, and that gets into the Pribilofs here. Here comes that warm air for you. Strong southeasterly flow still working through Kodiak Island, and even the Kenai Peninsula will continue the rain that you've seen today. That could mean mudslides are going to be a problem. So if you're in one of those flood-prone areas, or perhaps an area that's prone to mudslides, make sure you're keeping an eye on the hillside, as the rain and those winds will continue for you. The lower and middle Yukon Valley should start to see some drier weather as we get into the mid to late week, but up north, here comes another slug of colder air, and it's probably about time if you're on the Chukchi Seacoast. You'll start to see a better chance for snow showers there, most of that from Wainwright points southward into Kotzebue Sound. But around Kotzebue Sound, there could still be enough warm air that some freezing rain might be an issue, and that could continue into the northern parts of the Seward Peninsula as well. High pressure is not quite as strong in this case as it was today and tomorrow, but it's still present across the Yukon at 1,025 millibars, and that's still dry weather for southeastern Alaska and most of the Alcan villages there. Out across the lower and middle Yukon Valley, things are clearing up there. You've got a couple cold nights ahead, but at least you'll have a beautiful sunny day. South Central, you'll mainly see coastal rainfall there. The Cook Inlet should be relatively cloudy, but most areas to the south and west are going to be sogged in with plenty of rainfall and probably still some stiff wind. Here's a look at temperatures today. Mid to upper 30s for southeast after the sky cleared a little bit around Haines and Skagway. Temperatures made it into the lower 40s around Metlakatla and Ketchikan to the south. Temps there in the lower 40s as well. Prince William Sound in the 30s and 40s. Cordova a little bit milder than most. 52 in Homer, 43 around Talkeetna, Anchorage, a cooler 38 degrees. Just down the road, though, at the Weather Service office, it was 10 degrees warmer, so makes a big difference where in town you are. 28 around Glen Allen and Gulkana, 25 in Fairbanks, 30 in Eagle, 19 in Fort Yukon today. The Arctic coast in the teens and 20s. Is this November or is it August? Wow, that seems pretty warm for you. Kotzebue Sound in the mid-30s, 35 in Nome. Unalakleet reported 36 late afternoon, 38 in McGrath, same in Bethel this afternoon. Around King Salmon and Dillingham, we saw temperatures in the upper 30s and lower 40s. In fact, that warm weather spread all the way down past Cape Sarachev to the southern tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Just shy of 50 in Kodiak today, lower 40s for the Pribilofs, and the central and western chain were in the 30s and 40s. Overnight, you can see the effects of high pressure clearing the sky and keeping the air dry across the northern interior and areas near the Alcan in the single digits and low teens. South of that, where the moisture meets up with that warming wind, we see lows only in the 30s and 40s. That includes areas around Bristol Bay and Kodiak. Southeast, with a clear sky, expect some colder weather, 20s and 30s for you and the Seward Peninsula. And Nome in the lower 30s with the Arctic coast in the teens, and the Pribilofs and the Alaska Peninsula generally in the mid to upper 30s tonight. High temperatures tomorrow will remain mild from Kodiak all the way through Bristol Bay to Bethel in the lower 40s. The Arctic coast in the 20s and 30s. At Barrow only 26 though, 36 in Nome. Southeast in the mid to upper 40s. Juneau back in the mid 40s. Prince William Sound in the mid to upper 30s. Looks like Anchorage will push back into the upper 30s and lower 40s. And Fairbanks expecting a high just above freezing at 33. Flying weather shows IFR conditions along that swath of moisture moving in from the south and east across parts of the northern Gulf Coast, the Alaska Range, of course, and across parts of Bristol Bay and the southwestern coast through the Bering Strait. Here's your pass conditions. Anaktivik Pass expected to start at IFR with improvements noted through the afternoon. Adigan Pass should be there earlier in the day. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass are expected to be listed at IFR through most of your day. Rainy Pass probably more of the same, and it will be wet and windy with a lot of chop there. Expect some turbulence over Windy Pass, but conditions should be pretty clear. The turbulence will be an issue through Isabel Pass and probably Mentasta Pass through the day, but we expect VFR through Tanita Pass and a little less chop there. We saw some gusts in the Portage Valley today around 64 miles per hour. We expect that to continue throughout the daytime tomorrow, but IFR conditions may make that even a little bit more tricky to navigate. Chilkoot and White Pass, so with high pressure as your friend, expect VFR flying there as we go through tomorrow. Warm and wet weather continues to work its way northward. With that, you can see a spaghetti map of freezing levels across a good chunk of the eastern and southeastern parts of Alaska. There is cold weather to be had, and it starts just off the tip of the Seward Peninsula and very near Cold Bay and False Pass with that 2,000-foot freezing level. But a lot of warm air has invaded Alaska, and we will continue to see an overrunning situation through the remainder of the week. Icing potential is among us there. The occasional widespread moderate icing will start around 6,000 feet and above for the Seward Peninsula and parts of Norton Sound and Bristol Bay, as well as areas just west of Castle Cape and the southern tip of Kodiak Island, well out into the Gulf. Most areas in southeast, most areas around the Alaska Range and points north are lacking the moisture right now to see substantial icing potential. We do have some hit and miss spots out across the central and western Aleutians, generally above 4,000 feet as well. Your jet stream potential shows low pressure just racing right across the North Pacific from 120 to as high as 160 knots. And then it takes a little bump into a ridge of high pressure right into the Pacific Northwest. That's guiding that cold from the Arctic, dropping it down into the lower 48, and they are in chill mode tonight. High pressure, though, across the western Yukon and British Columbia is pushing that warm and wet air well north into the Arctic, and as such, it is blocking any major weather system right now from interrupting this flow. This is an omega block, and it is stuck in place, doing its job well. Unfortunately, that means you're probably not getting the weather that you're used to for probably mid to late November, and it looks like we'll be in that mode at least for the rest of the week. At 9,000 feet, a south and easterly flow continues across the mainland of Alaska. Wind speeds out over the water between 30 and 40 knots. Over the land, probably about 15 to 20. A little bit faster there right along the coast, 50 knots up the YK Delta and through the Bering Strait. High pressure slowing things down for southeastern Alaska. Wind speeds there around 20 to 30 knots. And low pressure is still guiding winds in from the north and west out across the western chain. A little bit lighter right over the Pribilofs, but more of a westerly flow from 25 to 35 knots over the chain. At 3,000 feet, our south and easterly flow is also met with some faster winds across the Gulf at 35 to 40 knots. Low pressure west of the Pribilofs has 20-knot winds coming in from the east across St. Matthew and more of a west and north flow coming across the central and western chain. Much faster flow coming over Kodiak and southwestern Alaska here. No wonder we've got a high wind warning. As some of that mixes down, there will be some substantial gusts there. Again, some of those could reach over 80 miles per hour. High pressure slows things down around the Alcan and for southeast, with wind speeds there only from 5 to as high as 15 knots. Turbulence, you guessed it. We're going to focus on southwestern Alaska for tomorrow. Below 6,000 feet, you could easily reach occasional moderate, if not isolated severe. So use your best judgment there and avoid the trouble spots and issue reports. If you have a PIREP and information you can pass on, that will help everybody in the aircraft community, of course, and of course keep weather forecasters on their toes throughout the day, and we love to see that happen. Below 4,000 feet across the lower and middle Yukon Valley and across light isolated moderate, mainly for Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound, and also across the western chain below 4,000 feet southeast and most of the interior looking A-OK. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with the rest of your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Her name is Patty Wagstaff, one of the most celebrated aerobatic pilots of all time. Three-time U.S. National Aerobatic Champion, she is the first woman to win this title. Because of her achievements, Patty has been honored by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum as a pioneer of flight, and her Goodrich Extra 260 aircraft occupies the same gallery at the Smithsonian as Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Vega.
I have to admit, what I do seems like a pretty dangerous way to make a living. I suppose that's part of the appeal, why so many people come out to see me fly and to see me take these risks. But as fellow pilots, I'll let you in on a little secret. There's risk, all right. As you know, anytime you climb into an aircraft, there's risk. But over the years, I've learned to minimize that risk by careful preparation, training, planning, common sense, and constant situational awareness. Attention to safety keeps me alive in the air. But safety doesn't begin at the top of an inverted loop. Safety begins on the ground before you get in your airplane.
As pilots, most of us have seen a great deal of change in airport operations over the past few years. Today, there are nearly 70 million tower operations annually, and the number is growing each year. Pilots are challenged with more and more complex air traffic procedures, more complicated airport layout design. More and more, it is an environment of very real risk. But just as Patty Wagstaff has developed strategies for mitigating risk in the air, pilots can do the same on the ground by following standard procedures, such as using airport diagrams and planning their taxi routes.
The great majority of runway incursions are caused by pilot error. And the great majority of those errors, more than 70%, are caused by general aviation pilots. Those of us who have been flying for a while remember that they didn't teach us much about runway safety back in the days when we were in training. In recent years, that's changed. The FAA has developed a number of educational programs and strategies to help pilots improve runway safety. In fact, with more than 650,000 pilots and more than 240,000 aircraft all conducting millions of operations around the clock, it's amazing how safe our airports are. But still, with the best of training, collisions can happen at any airport, at any time, to any pilot. We may be good pilots, but we are also human. And sometimes we make very human mistakes.
And ground Cessna 9301. Say again.
Runway incursions are most often the result of a loss of situational awareness. For a variety of reasons, the pilot becomes confused by the airport's signs and layout, or doesn't listen to or understand the controller's instructions, or simply fails to follow instructions.
Cessna 3 Sierra Papa.
Hold short, runway 26 left.
453 Sierra Papa, hold short, runway 26 left. Cessna 3 Sierra Papa, you're over the whole line.
Often this is because he or she is unfamiliar with the airport. The pilot's fatigued or is distracted by something in the cockpit.
You know what I was doing last night?
For a few critical seconds, pilots lose track of where they are in relation to their surroundings.
You can imagine how important it is for me to focus on situational awareness. In the air, my life depends on it. If I don't know precisely where I am and where I'm going, and the tasks required to get me there, the consequences could be catastrophic. And the same goes for you, and for me, on the ground.
One of the first keys to situational awareness is attention to detail even before you start your engine. Just as we always study area charts and weather information before we fly, it's important to be thoroughly familiar with the airport's layout before we taxi. Every airport is different, so it's important to obtain and study airport diagrams. Pay particular attention to complex or confusing runway and taxiway intersections and runway thresholds. Some airports publish hotspots on their airport diagrams, for example, intersections, where pilots should be especially vigilant. Obviously, we should make a similar study of the airport at our destination. Once you are thoroughly familiar with the airport layout, make sure you review the signs you will encounter as you taxi toward the active runway. Some simple phrases can help you remember what the signs mean. Black square, you're there. These black signs tell you which runway or taxiway you're on right now. Yellow array points the way. These yellow signs with black arrows point you toward a runway or a taxiway, or toward a destination, such as a ramp. If you see white numerals on a red sign, remember, red and white, runways in sight. This type of sign shows the hold position for the runway. Remember, yellow markings represent taxiways and white markings represent runways.
Looking at some of the warm weather that's been spreading northward, no doubt some of the ice has been eroding across the south and westerly coast and areas that are prone to that southerly wind. You can see a lack of ice there just offshore and south of Nome. Other areas are still looking at ice, and some of that will be getting a little bit softer, so make sure you're staying up on the ice edge conditions there. You can do that anytime by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. For southeast now, we're looking at a northerly flow coming down the Lynn Canal and into the central inner waterways, 20 to 25 knots with 4 to 5 foot seas for most of the inner waterways there. An offshore wind continues along the coast, generally 25 knots or so, with 8 to 9 foot seas, and some higher gusts are still possible in the region for Wednesday. By Thursday, winds are subsiding, 10 to 15 knots across the coastal areas, still looking at a gentle offshore breeze. Look at some stronger winds, though, north of Stevens Passage into the Lynn Canal, 20 to 35 knots with a gentle southeasterly wind working through Clarence Strait. Only 2 foot seas there. Conditions look to be spectacular by the end of the week. As we look at the north and western coast, look for an easterly flow moving across the region there and into the Kenai Peninsula, bringing rain with it. On top of that, some much stronger winds. You're looking at 40 to 50 knots coming through the Barren Islands, 17 to 19 foot seas there. Easterlies through Prince William Sound and just outside as well, 25 knots with 6 foot seas on the inside, 15 foot seas on the outside, and northeasterlies coming down Cook Inlet, 25 to 35 knots. And an east and southeasterly wind coming over Kodiak Island up to 45 knots with 19 foot seas on the eastern side of the island. By Thursday, conditions are improving somewhat. An east and northeasterly flow around Prince William Sound, 11 foot seas on the outside, 12 to as high as 17 foot seas there in the western Gulf. Northeasterlies continue down the Cook Inlet, and easterlies diminish to 30 knots west of the Barren Islands with a 9 foot sea, 8 foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait. Southerlies are working over the Alaska Peninsula by Wednesday afternoon, 15 to 25 knots on the Bering, and about the same there in the Pacific with 10 to 12 foot seas. 4 foot seas inside of Bristol Bay come up to 7 foot seas by Thursday with an easterly flow at 30 knots. And east and northeasterly winds are also coming up across the North Pacific. Look for 35 knots from Castle Cape to Chignik with a 17 foot sea by Thursday afternoon. Across the Aleutians on Wednesday, a gentle north and westerly flow will pick up a little bit more, 15 to 25 knots from Unalaska to Adak, 30 knot winds from Kiska to Attu, and northwesterlies from 15 to 25 knots across the North Pacific with 8 to 11-foot seas. By Thursday, we get more of an easterly flow on around Shemya, with north and easterly winds from Unalaska to Adak, about 25 to 30 knots, and about the same there across the North Pacific with seas as high as 10 to 15 feet. Across the west coast, south and easterly winds continue up the YK Delta to St. Lawrence Island, 15 to 25 knots at their strongest north of Nunivak Island with 6 to 7-foot seas. Easterlies bring 10-foot seas across the St. Matthew Island waters, but diminishing wind there from the Kuskokwim Bay to the Pribilofs, only at 10 knots, some of that variable with 5 to 10-foot seas. By Thursday, northeasterlies come back in with 20 knots and about 30 knots from the Kuskokwim Bay, coming in from the east with a 9-foot sea. Northeasterlies for the Pribilofs with an 8-foot sea there and 5-foot seas around St. Lawrence Island and north of Nunivak Island. Across the Arctic coast, there's enough ice to see easterly flow without any seas there. 20 knots all the way past Barrow toward Wainwright. Southeasterlies, though, still going at around Kotzebue Sound and from Point Hope to Cape Lisburn with 4 to 8-foot seas. By Thursday, winds become a little bit more variable and light around Kotzebue Sound. A southwesterly flow works up the Chukchi Seacoast at 20 to 25 knots. 7-foot seas there west of Cape Lisburn and Point Hope, and winds become relatively light and variable from Barrow 2 points eastward in the Beaufort Seacoast. Recapping tonight's weather, wind and warm weather will continue spreading across southwestern Alaska and the north and western Gulf Coast. Periods of rain and heavy rain will be possible for coastal areas in the Kenai Peninsula, especially around Seward, down through Kenai Fjords and into Kodiak Island. The wind will continue across into southwestern Alaska, where a high wind warning is in effect. That'll continue through noon, and we expect gusts there to reach over 80 miles per hour. For most of the Alaska range, expect some strong gusts, especially west of the Tok Cutoff, where you could see gusts upwards of 50 to 60 miles per hour. And then north of the lower and middle Yukon Valley into the Koyukuk Valley, periods of rain and snow are possible, but you may see some freezing rain mixed in with that. Most amounts look to be fairly light, and because of that, we're not expecting too many problems. A winter weather advisory is in effect for you. I expect about 5/100ths of an inch of freezing rain if that develops, and that's probably not enough to make a whole lot of damage possible, but it could make things slick, so do be extra careful. Out across the Bering, unsettled weather continues into Thursday with the strong southeasterly flow continuing and more wet weather's on the way. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.